Juste avant de commencer, bien sûr, je vous invite, s'il vous plaît, à prendre un moment pour vous accorder avec l'interprétation qui est disponible pour cette session. Comme dans toutes nos sessions pendant le forum, on aura du contenu vraiment dans les deux langues dans cette session, donc assurez-vous d'avoir choisi la langue de votre choix. So hi everyone, just before, as we get started, just inviting you to please make sure you set yourselves up with interpretation. This will be a bilingual session, and so want to make sure that you can understand all that is being said. My name is Nick Moyer. I'm really glad to be joining you for this actual last session of the Cooperation Forum that has gone on since Monday. We've been really pleased to see such a broad participation of our members in these conversations. And before going any further, and as we have in all of our sessions, and it is very important and close to our hearts, I do want to recognize that I'm joining you from Ottawa on the beautiful unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. Obviously something that we need to be thinking a lot about, reconciliation, and we've talked quite a bit about during the forum. So I do hope you know the people whose lands you are on today, wherever you are in Canada or elsewhere, and that you have thought about what your role is in contributing to reconciliation. Notre session aujourd'hui va être orientée sur les questions de code d'éthique. Vous savez peut-être que l'an dernier, au Forum de coopération, nous avons lancé notre membership à approuver un nouveau code d'éthique ou une mise à jour du code d'éthique de Coopération Canada. Nos membres nous disent de façon consistante l'importance du code d'éthique pour eux. Les nouveaux membres qui se joignent à Coopération Canada s'investissent, se souscrivent au code d'éthique. Il touche des éléments très, très importants de notre travail. Nous avons réfléchi beaucoup à comment nous pourrions donner plus de vie à notre code d'éthique. Au-delà de faire simplement sa promotion, on s'est dit qu'il était important pour nous de créer des conversations sur les éléments du code d'éthique pour pouvoir approfondir nos connaissances, créer des dialogues, élever les meilleures pratiques et donner un peu plus de contenu qui puisse aider à l'interprétation, à la mise en pratique du code d'éthique. Et donc, nous avons décidé de commencer une fois par année à faire un regard approfondi sur une section du code d'éthique. Et nous avons décidé de commencer cette année en regardant les enjeux de communication. And so, the code of ethics for us, and I should actually, if you're not familiar with the code of ethics, I hope that you are, but we'll get to that in a moment. I will pop into the chat just links again if you want to be referring to our code of ethics along the way. You should be able to find it easily on our website, but here are the links for you. Really, our objective is to today be consulting with you as we talk through what, beyond what's written in the code of ethics, what does ethical communications look like? What does unethical communications look like? How do we wrestle with some of the sometimes difficult questions that we need to ask about somehow I went on mute, but I think that's the brief introduction I wanted to give. We are going to do this session in a very interactive way, and we're going to be turning to a few people that have really thought about ethics in our sector and in communications to guide us through a conversation, one that I hope you'll be very actively involved in. Now, just before we get started and before we introduce our speakers, I'd like to just sort of get a bit of the lay of the land with you. And so we're going to pop up a Zoom poll right now and asking you whether you're familiar with our code of ethics. Have you read it? Have you not read it? Maybe you don't know. And the second question is whether you have any internal guidelines or processes for communications approval that address development sector ethics within your organization around dignity, for example, anti-racism. J'aimerais dire, en fait, je crois que les interprètes auront interprété. On n'avait pas la place de rentrer le langage français, mais j'espère que vous avez entendu mon interprétation via les interprètes. Alors, so I would say that I'm glad to see that 2/3 are familiar with our code of ethics, or at least know it exists. I certainly hope that you will take a moment to get to know it. Assuming that the large majority of you are members of Cooperation Canada, I can't assume that some of you aren't, but your organization has signed on and is committed to being held to account against the Code of Ethics. And it's a really critical document, really invite you to spend some time to get to know it. Now, we're going to be focusing in on communications elements, not specifically talking just about the Code of Ethics, but really with an orientation towards creating guidance, elevating best practice with respect to communications in in international cooperation. And to guide us in this conversation will be moderated by John Cameron, who joins us. Well, you'll tell us where exactly you are, John, but John's an associate professor of international development studies at Dalhousie University, and he's focused a lot on indigenous autonomy in Latin America, development and climate change communications and policy advocacy. And it's really a pleasure that you can join us today. And so, John, I'll hand over to you, and you'll be able to introduce our two other speakers. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. As Nick just explained, I teach international development studies at Dalhousie University in Halifax, which is also on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Much of my current teaching and research focuses on both development and climate change communications and advocacy. So it's a real privilege for me to be playing a role in this workshop. I'm going to speak in English, but we've got one of our guest speakers will speak in French, the other will speak in English, and we're happy to receive questions in both languages. And if you haven't found the button for simultaneous interpretation, it's on the bottom of your Zoom screen, the panel of buttons at the bottom. So I'll just quickly introduce our two guest speakers and then explain the format for the workshop, and then hand the microphone over to the guest speakers. So our first speaker is Professor Lisa Ann Ritchie, who is a professor of globalization in the Department of Management, Society, and Communication at the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. Currently, she's leading two related research projects. One is titled Commodifying Compassion, Implications of Turning People and Humanitarian Causes into Marketable Things, and a second research project on everyday humanitarianism in Tanzania. She is also the author of the books Batman Saves the Congo, Business Disruption and the Politics of Development, with co-author Alexandra Budabin, this book was just published. She's also the author of Brand Aid, Shopping Well to Save the World, with co-author Stefano Ponte, and the book Population Politics and Development, From the Policies to the Clinics. Our second speaker, Marieto Diallo, is a communications co-director at the organization Interpares, where she coordinates Interpares' communication and online fundraising strategies. She's also a member of the Interpares Engagement Committee, Public Engagement Committee, and the French language media contact for Interpares. Marieto holds a master's degree in international communication at the Marc Bloch University of Strasbourg in France, and a master's program in master's diploma in project management from the Université du Québec en Outaouais. Prior to working at Interpares, Marieto worked as a communications assistant at the Council of Europe. So in terms of the format today, we're going to begin with a short 5-minute intervention from each of our speakers, who are going to share their perspectives, one from an academic perspective, the other from a more practitioner perspective on the ethics of communication in international cooperation work. I'm then going to invite you, the participants in this session, to respond to a series of 4 questions about ethics and communication. And as Nick explained, we'll be using the software Menti, which will appear on the screen, and you'll be prompted to enter your responses to each question. We'll have about 10 minutes to engage with each question. And as you are entering your responses into Menti on the screen, Marietu and Lisa will invite them to discuss the responses as they appear. So I'm certainly looking forward to an engaging and dynamic session with you. So I will now hand the Zoom microphone over to Lisa and Richie, who's joining us from Copenhagen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. I'd like to share my screen with you if that's possible. I'm going to give that a go and see if that will work, just because I had a couple of, well, visuals, since I thought we were going to talk about pictures. That might be a nice possibility. Let me see if that will work. Hopefully. Oops, sorry, I'm getting up the wrong thing. So hopefully this will now come up for you.
I'll just remind everybody else to put themselves on mute while they're not speaking.
Okay, can you see my screen now? Fantastic. So what you see, hi everybody. First of all, just to say, I know I have only 5 minutes, but I would like to use the first few minutes just to thank you very much for your invitation, and also for the possibility of engaging in these questions and answers and discussions with you about the work that you do, and a little bit about the work that I do. So when we're thinking a little bit about images and ethics in communication, I just thought I'd show you these two images, which I think are kind of different in terms of the emotions that perhaps they provoke, which are about me having received this new book that I just published, which I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, which, as John has mentioned, is here, Batman Saves the Congo. What you might not know about Batman, or you may if you're a superhero fan, is that Batman is a really interesting superhero in the group of heroes because he has no actual superpowers. And he talks about that. Do you know what Batman's superpower actually is? It's being super rich. And the very interesting thing, of course, is like many of the philanthropists and super rich that we look to today to solve the world's problems, he inherited this money from his parents. And to be fair, he's really trying to do the best with it, but he's finding that this is a very difficult job. So I would like to just take a few minutes to deep dive with you into some of the hard stuff of ethical communications and development work that I've actually found out in the process of looking very deeply at Batman for the past half decade, actually a little bit more than that. And also just to say that I welcome any of you to contact me at any point also afterward. If there's anything that you're interested in my work or you don't have access, sometimes I know you get blocked behind paywalls, and I'm very much against this academic publishing model that makes people pay for what I'm actually paid for by the government. I'm a state employee. So you just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to make sure that anything is available to you for free. So one thing I wanted to do was just to pull up for you one of the things I think is quite interesting in this code of conduct, because when I was actually given access to it and started to read it, thinking a little bit about what we talk about today, I was extremely impressed with how thoughtful, how grounded, and how detailed this code of conduct actually is. And what seems really clear to me is that you're extremely thoughtful and clear about what is happening in terms of the complexity of the world in which we live, where we're all trying to do work which engages people from very different places, different cultures, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic places, without portraying this historical legacy of colonialism, of exploitation, of inequality, and of racism, which frankly is something that is really a long and heavy legacy in work that we try to do in development and humanitarianism. And I see this when I read actually that you're talking about trying to portray local communities as active agents in their own development process and do not feel prejudice or foster a sense of Northern superiority. But I'd also like to say that from the work that I've done, taking quite a deep dive at a very successful organization, started by Batman, the celebrity who played one of the Batman, Ben Affleck, who is an American A-list celebrity, in case any of you don't follow popular culture. He started his own organization in 2010 called the Eastern Congo Initiative, which has two different prongs. One of them is policy advocacy work in the United States, with elite policymakers, particularly in Congress, to make policies that he and his organization deem would be favorable for the people living in Eastern Congo. Now, the other thing he does is actually run an on-the-ground implementation regranting organization, which has a lot of interesting complications about what it does. But in short, it tries to give money to local organizations as part of what they do to back up the work that they do in the policymaking realm. As you can imagine, they rely very heavily on imagery like the things that you see here. You see Ben Affleck listening very patiently to a woman in Eastern Congo talking about her experience with gender-based violence, which was featured in a very popular American news magazine. You see him in the middle testifying before the United States Congress, which he's done 5 times as an expert on the Democratic Republic of Congo. You see him on the right selling a chocolate bar on American TV. And at the bottom, walking in one of the refugee camps, which his organization is supporting. What I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, though, is the structure of communications as corporate branding, which I think that probably many of you have experienced very much more in your day-to-day lives. What we see is that there are new actors and interests in development communications. It isn't simply a question of organizations making their own communications choices. We have other actors like professional marketing firms and branding firms. Ben Affleck's organization used a plethora of elite, very well networked consultancy firms like Williams-Works, which is based in the United States and has a lot of political connections with families like the Clintons, the Clinton Foundation, the Gates Foundation. There are also marketing firms and celebrities who come in involved in certain organizations and corporate partners. So a lot of the work that I've done has been also to talk to them about what they're trying to do in development and how that may actually complicate some of the ethical issues that I think that we're all trying to discuss today. What they do is what we call affective visibility. It's where you produce pictures and ideas that allow your feelings to be seen, showing images that are seen and feel real, but they're actually highly produced or staged. They're curated for customer satisfaction and citizen support to try to give good feelings to everyone who helps. But what often happens to organizations who try to produce different kinds of imagery is that then they get perceived as being actually inauthentic, because sometimes if you actually show real pictures of work, it just doesn't feel real. And the reason is because these scripts have been so effectively set by these extremely competent firms, teaching people how they should feel about development. So one thing I think would be interesting to think about is how is it that non-governmental organizations and partners can provide more than content for corporate partners, because that is what they talk about and that is what they want from organizations on the ground. There's been a lot of scholarship about this kind of work, but I think it's important for the nonprofit sector overall to think about how is it that we think about context? What can you do? What is your room for maneuver? So I'd like to end with thinking that one of the things that I came up with when I was doing research on my book is how important the context of contemporary helping, whether it's development in a long-term or humanitarian helping for crisis situations, really makes a difference. The quote that you see here from the first page of the book is from an official in a high-ranking donor agency working in Kinshasa, where I did fieldwork in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the man looked at me and he said, when I just went to start an interview, exactly what you read here. He said, development aid is not what it used to be, with agencies, he said, like his agency, doing most of the work. It's now all about collaborations between the private sector, businesses, and philanthropists. And so I think it's very important for us to think about what this actually means, and particularly what it means to you. My understanding is that the NGO sector has been expected to take on the roles of professional humanitarian actors, states, and business support, while at the same time receiving less core funding than ever before. This is certainly the case in Denmark, where I work. So I also think that the NGOs are engaging celebrities and other businesses just to raise the funding that they need to do the work they want to do for their causes. NGOs are also at the same time being forced to compete for corporate attention in what is a veritable beauty pageant, right? Where you have to have the most photogenic beneficiaries, you have to span local and global causes, and produce impact reports at a professional level of a Harvard economist, but graphics which are done by Pixar. So it has to be extremely competent and professional on one hand, and very entertaining and engaging and emotional on the other. I think this is a hard job that you have to do, and I really respect the work that you're doing trying to do it. I would also say that my experience in doing work in this sector is that it's never for lack of good intentions that we end up having ethical dilemmas, but the dilemmas are there. And I think that they're not just a question about whether or not you choose one photograph or another. I think it's a question about how it is you actually respond to a context in which there are so many different incentives pushing for different kinds of engagement. I'll conclude by saying that for me, the trajectory really from underdevelopment to development, and I've been a development studies professor now for over 2 decades, which feels like a very long time, but it really is a lot about a story that we tell ourselves. And we really need to think about this story, right? Development in the long term or humanitarianism in the short term really is a highly crafted script. And what we're trying to do is to tell the story about what we're giving. But the way that we often do this is by producing a very narrow and a very branded story, which then obscures the question of what we're actually taking. So I'd like to say that I think that some of the ethical issues that I hope we'll discuss are going to be about how to balance out the taking and the giving, and how partnership can actually come to be something which is not just happening in practice, but also communicated in practice. Thank you so much for your time.
Great, thanks very much, Lisa. And it's a really helpful reminders of the ways in which the international cooperation sector globally is changing very quickly, and then within that, the community is changing. Sorry, those automated voices keep interrupting. So I think we'll just quickly turn the microphone over to Mariette to share her perspective, her practitioner's perspective from Inter Pares. Over to you, Mariette.
Oui, donc bonjour à toutes et à tous. Donc aujourd'hui, je vais m'adresser à vous en français. Déjà, merci de m'avoir invitée. Je suis ravie de pouvoir partager avec vous mon expérience en tant que co-directrice des communications à Inter Pares. Lisanne, juste après avoir entendu votre exposé, en fait, j'ai hâte de lire ce livre et je suis sûre que je serai d'accord avec toute votre analyse. En fait, je pense qu'on se rejoint sur beaucoup de points. Alors, en fait, Inter Pares, notre communication est vraiment assez spéciale. Je vais dire, déjà, il faut savoir que c'est une organisation féministe, donc qui lutte pour la justice sociale un petit peu partout à travers le monde, donc en Afrique, en Asie, en Amérique latine et ici au Canada. Et on travaille en collaboration donc avec des activistes, donc vraiment des activistes. Et notre philosophie, en fait, c'est vraiment qu'on travaille entre égaux, donc d'où le nom de l'organisation. Et ça se reflète jusque dans notre façon de communiquer. Alors, on communique souvent sur différents points. Donc, ça peut s'agir de la paix et la démocratie, le contrôle des ressources, la justice économique, la souveraineté alimentaire, la santé ou encore la migration. Alors, en fait, pour nous, si vous voulez, une communication éthique, c'est avant tout une communication qui est complètement intègre. Donc, on cherche vraiment à avoir de l'intégrité dans tous nos aspects de communication. Alors, si vous voulez, non seulement il y a cette composante d'intégrité, mais il y a aussi la composante de féminisme et aussi d'intersectionnalité dans tout ce que nous faisons. Et il faut savoir que notre communication éthique, en fait, elle s'articule autour de deux principaux points. Déjà, dans notre département de communication, on essaie de travailler le plus possible avec le département de levée de fonds parce qu'on estime que ce sont deux départements qui sont complémentaires. En fait, notre communication, non seulement elle a vocation à sensibiliser puis à partager les différentes causes pour lesquelles on se bat, pour lesquelles on travaille, mais également on cherche à faire de la levée de fonds. Donc, si vous voulez, les deux départements travaillent vraiment de pair. Puis, juste pour rejoindre ce que Lisanne disait, en fait, beaucoup d'organisations de coopération internationale aujourd'hui, pour la levée de fonds, vont aller chercher l'émotion. Donc, en fait, cette émotion, on va la chercher, mais ce qu'on cherche à faire, c'est à Inter Pares, pour certaines autres organisations de coopération internationale également, c'est de ne pas juste, on ne veut pas, si vous voulez, que nos donateurs ou notre public soient juste des acteurs de la charité. On ne veut pas qu'ils soient juste des personnes qu'on utilise comme pour un marketing dans une organisation privée. Alors, ce qu'on cherche dans les deux points auxquels notre communication éthique s'articule, c'est vraiment donc de promouvoir une collecte de fonds et une communication qui est éthiquement et socialement responsable. Puis également de développer donc des stratégies de communication externes qui sont basées sur une analyse intersectionnelle donc pour différents objectifs. Donc, ces différents objectifs, c'est souvent donc de mettre en lumière le leadership et le travail donc de changement social des femmes pour nous, donc, étant donné qu'on est une organisation féministe, mais également d'autres personnes qui sont marginalisées. On essaie également de mettre en lumière donc, le leadership et le travail, donc du travail de changement social, comme je viens de me répéter, mais également de partager donc, des perspectives, des analyses, des idées qui sont proposées pour éclairer donc, la population, notamment donc, les femmes puis les personnes qui sont marginalisées. D'autre part, on essaie de partager des perspectives, des analyses et des idées qui sont… on essaie d'utiliser un langage sensible qui est inclusif au genre. Puis on essaie également de faire attention donc, au langage au Canada, donc faire en sorte qu'on ait toujours un langage en français, un langage en anglais, donc pour l'accessibilité. Ça, c'est vraiment dépendamment du public qu'on essaie de rejoindre. Après, des fois, il nous arrive de faire des productions donc, qui sont destinées à un public externe, donc hors du Canada, donc un public qui est plus dans les pays avec lesquels on travaille. Puis dans ces cas-là, on essaie également d'inclure des langues de ces pays-là. Donc, le travail, on essaie de faire en sorte que nos communications soient le plus inclusives possible. Également, on essaie d'utiliser des descriptions qui reflètent donc, les identités par lesquelles les personnes se décrivent elles-mêmes, parce qu'il nous semble tout à fait important que chaque personne est l'expert de sa propre situation, chaque homologue également est expert de sa propre situation, que nous ne devons pas, donc, si vous voulez, décrire ou prendre les mots de leur bouche pour les décrire ou pour expliquer leur propre situation. Donc, on essaie que le temps soit peu, donc de les inclure dans nos processus de création de contenu pour les communications, parce qu'on estime qu'il ne nous appartient pas à nous seuls de les décrire ou d'évoquer les situations dans lesquelles ils sont. Alors, souvent, quand on parle justement, comme Mme Richer venait tout juste de le mentionner, les images. Donc, les images, c'est très, très important. Alors, on fait très attention à quelle image utiliser. Donc, dans le code d'éthique de Coopération Canada, effectivement, c'est très, très bien détaillé, comment faire les choix des photos. Nous avons adapté cette façon de faire il y a déjà quelques années. Et pour nous, c'est vraiment très, très, très important, l'image. Il faut dire que pendant plusieurs années, dans le secteur de la coopération internationale, et je pense que c'est ce qui s'inscrit un petit peu dans l'histoire des populations cibles, il y a eu beaucoup de misérabilisme. Puis il y a eu beaucoup d'images qui ont fait du dommage, si vous voulez, aux populations qu'on voulait aider. Et en fait, je suis contente que maintenant, de plus en plus, on fasse attention à l'image qui est véhiculée donc des personnes qu'on aide. Par contre, c'est un processus qui est assez long et je trouve qu'il est difficile de déconstruire un petit peu cette imagerie-là qu'on a des pays du Sud en général. Alors, on essaie d'utiliser des images qui évitent de renforcer donc, des idées qui sont préconçues, qui sont néfastes donc, pour le genre, pour les identités, les relations raciales ou également toutes les identités qui sont marginalisées. Donc, on fait attention aux images qu'on propose. Je sais que beaucoup d'organisations comme nous essaient le plus souvent possible de demander à avoir des autorisations pour les photos qu'on publie. On essaie le plus souvent possible de les avoir. Par contre, juste nous, par exemple, nos photos ne sont pas… On n'est pas une organisation qui travaille spécifiquement, si vous voulez, avec les enfants. Je sais qu'il y a plusieurs organisations qui travaillent beaucoup plus avec les enfants. Nous évitons d'utiliser, parce qu'on a ce choix-là, mais on essaie d'utiliser le moins possible les photos avec les enfants. On trouve qu'il est souvent difficile d'avoir beaucoup de, si vous voulez, comment dire, on n'est pas toujours très sûr du consentement. Est-ce qu'on sait qu'est-ce qui a pu se passer derrière? Est-ce qu'on sait ce qu'il y a eu de la manipulation? On ne sait pas. Donc, on essaie le plus souvent d'éviter d'utiliser cette imagerie-là, mais c'est parce qu'on a le loisir de le faire, étant donné que notre focus est plus un focus féministe et qu'on n'a pas si vous voulez, notre but principal, ce n'est pas les photos d'enfants. mais c'est juste pour vous dire que ce sont des choses qui peuvent arriver et qui, des fois, en tant que praticien de la communication, on a des choix à faire. Puis, notre choix à nous, c'est d'utiliser le moins possible cette imagerie-là des enfants. Autrement, pour vous donner un exemple, on travaille avec différents activistes en Birmanie, par exemple, ou en Colombie, ou dans d'autres États d'Amérique latine, où les activistes sont en danger souvent. Alors, avant de publier leurs photos, on est obligé de faire plusieurs vérifications, on est obligé de demander pour ne pas mettre leur vie à risque, par exemple, ou pour ne pas faire de dommages au travail qu'ils effectuent sur place. Donc, des fois, on a un peu de difficulté avec les photos. Ce n'est pas juste l'imagerie, la scène en tant que telle, mais on fait attention également au consentement en tant que tel. Alors, autre chose qui est très important pour nous, c'est aussi de sensibiliser à l'inégalité et à l'oppression qui est fondée sur le sexe, et également sur les hiérarchies qui sont socialement et culturellement construites. Pour nous, en fait, être féministe, c'est vraiment apporter une analyse de pouvoir à tout. Puis pour cela, il faut être conscient des relations de pouvoir telles qu'elles se manifestent un peu partout. Et je pense qu'il est très important de savoir qu'en tant que personne communicante, et dans la communication qu'on a ici dans la coopération internationale, il existe également une dynamique de pouvoir envers nos homologues du Sud. Donc, on a le pouvoir de contrôler la façon dont ils sont représentés dans nos canaux de communication. Mais il est important, je pense, de les inclure dans toutes nos communications, justement, parce que on utilise, si vous voulez, leur contenu, on utilise leur vie, on utilise leur savoir. Donc, c'est important de les inclure dans le processus de communication. Il est vrai que ce n'est pas toujours possible, mais c'est vraiment ce qui est le plus préconisé. Alors, oui, donc c'est ça que je souhaitais vous partager pour un début. Mais je voulais également dire qu'il est vraiment très, très important de faire attention aux émotions et de faire en sorte que l'émotion ne prenne pas le dessus sur l'information. Il arrive souvent qu'il y ait des crises quelque part dans certains pays, ou des crises sur lesquelles nous voulons capitaliser pour informer. La façon dont on communique peut avoir un effet, si vous voulez, inverse. On peut parler du momentum, beaucoup, mais souvent le public ne saura pas grand-chose sur la cause que nous défendons ou sur le contexte général. Donc, je pense qu'il est très important de faire attention à ces différents aspects-là. Donc, voilà, c'est ce que je voulais partager pour un début.
Merci beaucoup, Mariettu. So I'd like to hear from you now. So our panelists, I think we have about 65 of you. Nick has just posted in the chat the link to the Menti. So if you can click on that, we then invite you to respond to our first question. What does unethical communication look like? And here I'd like to prompt everyone. I think many of us can immediately visualize the classic, the almost stereotypical images of unethical communication, the starving, dark-skinned African children with flies buzzing around their eyes. So certainly I think that's an important example to include and to reflect on why it is unethical. But I'd also like to encourage people to try to think beyond that classic stereotypical image of poverty porn, so to speak, and to try and imagine other forms of unethical communication. Mariettu and Lisa, as the images are coming up on the screen, I also will see many more. Are there any particular signals or flags for you of unethical communication? Or any of the many responses coming up on the screen, if you see any that catch your attention and you think are particularly important to highlight, please feel free to jump in and comment on them. We're getting lots of responses, which is fantastic.
Est-ce que je peux m'exprimer?
Mariettu, go ahead if you want to comment on any of these.
En fait, je pense qu'une communication qui n'est pas du tout éthique encore une fois, on le voit dans les réponses, ça a toujours un lien avec les images. Ou ce qui nous vient tout de suite à l'esprit, c'est les images. Puis moi, je pense que, comme on disait tout à l'heure, en fait, déconstruire tout le mal qui a été fait depuis plusieurs années avec des images qui montrent des enfants avec un ventre ballonné, qui ont faim, puis qui ont besoin de l'aide de la personne blanche. Alors, dans l'imaginaire collectif, les gens pensent qu'en Afrique, il y a justement que ce genre, que la vie en Afrique, c'est ça. Alors, l'Africain, il faut l'aider, puis l'aide, ça doit toujours venir des pays occidentaux ou des pays du Nord, mais ce n'est pas vrai. Je veux dire, aujourd'hui, il y a beaucoup de jeunes organisations de coopération qui travaillent, qui sont les personnes du cru, si vous voulez, qui essaient de changer les choses. Et je pense qu'on devrait promouvoir ça. On devrait pouvoir être en sorte de partager des images positives et de faire en sorte que les gens collaborent. Donc, ce qu'on voudrait, en fait, c'est vraiment, si vous voulez, cet esprit de collaboration. Là, je vais vous donner un petit exemple. À Interpares, par exemple, nous travaillons beaucoup avec des cliniques autochtones ou des maisons pour les femmes. Et nous travaillons également avec des cliniques pour les femmes aux Philippines. Alors, nous avons créé, si vous voulez, c'est une organisation qui s'appelle l'ICAAN. Donc, on fait venir les personnes de l'ICAAN pour rencontrer donc, le public canadien. Mais ces personnes-là sont expertes si vous voulez, de leur situation et communiquent elles-mêmes sur ce qui se passe aux Philippines. Et il y a un échange qui se crée. Puis le public canadien est capable d'entendre par lui-même ce qu'il y a dans ces pays-là. Donc, je pense qu'il est très, très important de collaborer avec les homologues des pays du Sud pour essayer de déconstruire justement toute cette imagerie négative et savoir que la coopération internationale, quelque part, c'est dans les deux sens. On apprend autant des pays du Sud que eux apprennent de nous. Donc, c'est un travail ensemble, je pense que ce qu'on devrait promouvoir dans une communication éthique, c'est ce pouvoir-là de collaboration.
Great, thanks. As I'm watching these stories or concerns come up on the screen, I see a lot of them reflect imagery and narratives of people in the global South. Lisa, I want to turn to you for a second because your book it's titled Batman Saves the Congo, and the images that you shared with us are not of a poor dark-skinned hungry child in the global South, but of a super rich North American actor. On the surface of things, it would seem that images of Ben Affleck avoid many of the problems that we're seeing flash up on the screen, but I suspect, having been, partway into your book now, that you have ethical concerns about images of super rich superheroes in the development context. Can you say a little bit more about why it might also be problematic to represent poverty and development with images of celebrities?
Yeah, thanks, John. No, absolutely. And I've also just noticed, I'm actually writing down a lot of the comments here also that Mary too was also speaking about, because I think that there is so much resonance here with the struggle trying to get to the hard stuff. I mean, it's kind of easy, as you've also said, to not just sort of avoid the things that we've learned about in the past decade are really bad things to do. But it's harder sometimes to see these images of, Ben Affleck, who is this very, lovely, charismatic celebrity because that's his job. And to see him sort of performing, listening, right? And thinking about what that does to our image about development. And I think that I saw somebody else's comment earlier saying, leaving out a husband or a father who's there. And in some ways thinking about, well, who is he replacing in this image, right? He's replacing, the Congolese husband or father who might just as well be the person sitting and listening to the woman, express her difficulties and experiences with gender-based violence. But in our imaginary, right, those Congolese men are just perpetrators of violence. And this is where we get into the really complicated questions, right? And the really difficult stories. And I'm not a nostalgic romantic person that thinks that all Westerners are bad and all Africans are good. I mean, we know that everyone is complex in the world, right? But the problem is that we kind of get these scripts that keep going over and over again. and they feel right. Like they feel good to us to see Ben Affleck, sitting and being patient and listening. When we think about, though, what is it that we don't see because we see him? If I might just one other second just to say, I think pictures sometimes are also easier than other kinds of communication. And one thing I would have told you if I hadn't already gone over my time a bit, which I have in the book, in the epilogue, was that this organization, for example, had some very interesting health promotional materials around COVID-19 in Eastern Congo. And one of the things that happens if you look at their posters, I mean, they're very well done. They look very much like any kind of health communication that we're used to seeing put out by, say, the Ministry of Health. But they're not put out by the Ministry of Health. They're put out by an American NGO led by a celebrity and a for-profit social enterprise that charges people money for things like basic healthcare and water. And sure, the information they were giving about COVID-19 was real. Okay, they weren't telling people the wrong things. But what they were also doing was convincing people and kind of confusing them about what was the role of, their public health sector versus what is the role of helpful, benevolent superheroes from, the United States or for-profit businesses. So kind of thinking on the other side, if we're seeing something, what is it we're not seeing? And I'll just leave it at there. Thank you for asking.
Great. So just as we watch these images, these responses come in, there seems to be a good, a full kind of representation of concerns about unethical, of imagery that represents people in the global south as one-dimensional, as lacking dignity, as lacking agency, and simultaneously a number of responses that highlight the concerns about overemphasizing the agency of Northern actors, and in particular, NGOs. I see one on white aid workers. So even though those images may not be images of, may not be representing poor people in the global south, they may be overemphasizing the agency of the global north. And thank you, Lisa, for also highlighting some of the ways in which new approaches to highly corporatized approaches to communications are also complicating our consideration of ethics. I think this is a good time to move on to our second question, and Nick will bring it up onto the screen, which is the inverse of the first question. How do you know ethical communications when you see it? This is a good opportunity to put in a plug for the Cooperation Canada Code of Ethics as a resource for thinking about ethical communications. But do you have other tools or methods for thinking about and identifying ethical communications, either in your own work or the work of other organizations? So please go ahead and start responding. And it's just as we watch these responses come in, again, Marietu and Lisa, I'll invite each of you to comment. It's interesting with the first response, very quick, informed consent. Interestingly, we can't know whether the people in the pictures have given their consent unless it's explicitly indicated. So in many cases, even if an organization has taken careful measures to assure the consent of the people in the pictures, we don't always know. So Marietu and Lisa, again, if you see particular responses here that you'd like to reflect on, I encourage you to just jump in.
Well, could I just ask a question, maybe, if people would want to discuss or think a little bit about informed consent? One thing I thought was really interesting in some of the work I've been doing, and this was particularly the case in Uganda, was when consent was used as a verb, where someone's going to consent you, and thinking a little bit about whether consent is a one-time thing where you sign off. I say, hey, I got this photo of you, Ben Affleck, on my cover of my book. Can I use that? And Ben's agent says, sure, or no. Or whether or not it's a process. Like maybe there's one thing, which is, yeah, you can stick it on an academic book, but I don't know, if somebody comes along and wants to make a competing movie from it, then maybe I couldn't use it again. Or if I say, hey, here's an idea, let me sell this to some organization and I'm going to make some money and they're going to use it for something else. thinking about, sort of different processes and how do we deal with that consent side. So I'm putting that out as a question, unfortunately not as an answer.
Marietta, are there any of these responses so far that spark reflections from you?
Oui, alors encore le consentement, je pense que c'est assez... on essaie de l'avoir le plus souvent possible, mais ce n'est pas toujours évident, comme l'a souligné Lisanne. Donc, en fait, nous, quand les photos viennent vraiment de nos homologues, on se fie à eux. Puis, en discutant avec on a souvent des rencontres avec les personnes qui sont responsables des communications, puis on s'assure toujours de rappeler, est-ce que les photos qu'on utilise ont un consentement? Puis elles nous disent oui, non. Est-ce qu'on peut utiliser cette photo? On souhaite utiliser telle photo pour tel ou tel médium. Puis dans ces cas-là, ils nous autorisent à le faire. Mais encore une fois, j'avoue que c'est quelquefois un couteau à double tranchant, mais on fait confiance à nos homologues. Puis, en fait, pour revenir un peu à la photo de Ben Affleck, quand je regarde ces photos d'un point de vue d'une personne qui pratique la communication, c'est tellement posé. On a l'impression que c'est une histoire, puis tout est déjà fait, tout est déjà calculé, donc c'est très, très, très polissé. Je n'ai pas l'impression que ce sont des images qui viennent du cru, des images qu'on a prises sur le fait, puis où on partage. Elles sont destinées à un public et elles ont un objectif spécifique. Donc, je pense que c'est différent de photos qu'on va prendre, qu'un homologue va prendre de ses propres activités, puis va nous autoriser à les utiliser. Donc, c'est deux types de photos qui sont différentes, si vous voulez. J'aime beaucoup dans les réponses, je vois direct quotes, puis ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on apprécie beaucoup. Moi, j'aime beaucoup ça. Des fois, on peut avoir des photos, puis avoir le direct quote qui est à côté, puis on sait que c'est authentique, puis c'est un partage qui vient d'une personne qui a sa propre expérience, et ce ne sont pas toujours nos mots à nous. C'est pas toujours nous qui expliquons la situation. Donc, c'est une situation c'est un témoignage qui vient directement donc d'une personne, et on trouve que par là, la communication, si vous voulez, elle est beaucoup plus... elle peut créer, si vous voulez, une cause commune. Donc là, on a beaucoup plus de poigne sur ce qu'on fait. Mais encore une fois, pour certaines, tout à l'heure, j'ai vu qu'on voyait beaucoup l'aspect de photos qui sont posées et polissées. Puis, des fois, on n'est pas toutes des grosses ONG qui avons la possibilité de faire des grosses campagnes de communication ou d'envoyer des gestionnaires de programmes qui peuvent prendre des photos ou que nos homologues au Sud peuvent prendre les photos. Et donc, des fois, certains sont obligés de prendre des photos dans des banques d'images. Et les photos de banques d'images ne sont pas authentiques. Elles sont, pour la majorité, sont posées. Puis, il faut à ces moments-là faire des choix. Donc, je pense que c'est reconnaître une communication éthique, ça dépend, oui, le consentement éclairé, la transparence, oui, les citations directes, ce genre de choses. Donc, il y a plusieurs points. Mais encore une fois, je pense que c'est vraiment à travailler. Mais l'objectif principal d'une communication éthique, je pense, c'est vraiment de pouvoir bâtir cette cause commune. Mais encore une fois, ça dépend de l'objectif et de l'audience qu'on a en face de nous.
Thank you. As I'm reading these responses coming in, I think they're going to be really useful. They reflect in many ways the core principles of ethical communication that are in the Cooperation Canada code. And certainly, I think one of the useful things about the code is that it's short, it's simple, it's clear. 4 key points that easily fit onto half a page, so we can remember them. But a lot of your responses here are also pushing us to think beyond the concise wording in the code to really interpret that. And I think that some of the work that we need to do is make sense out of the very clear, concise language in the code and put that into practice. There was a response that somebody suggested that kind of giving the full context of an image, so the person, did they provide consent? What's their story? Where are they located? I think that's the one, yeah. This pushes us to think beyond just the ideas in the code. So it's also worth, I think, reflecting on where might there be gaps in the code of ethics, or where might we need to have deeper discussions about what the principles in the code of ethics actually mean in practice. So this is all really helpful. And see a comment from Nick reflecting on how there's a lot of encouragement to think about the choices about imagery and stories or narratives after they've already been created. But in terms of that creative process, I think also important to think about the whole spectrum of the creative process. Earlier, Marietto invited us to told us about how Interpares tries to include their partner organizations in the process of creating communications. So rather than just taking the images and then making the ethical decisions afterwards, there's a whole spectrum from the creation of images and narratives up to the final decisions. I also just, at the risk of shameless self-promotion, I also just wanted to note here, self-promotion of my own research, encourage people to think beyond images and text, also to sound and music. I just worked on a recent project about the representations of global poverty and development in music and sound. And so imagine watching an NGO fundraising video with your eyes closed, listening to the music, and what are the narratives and stories that come through in that music or in the sounds. And in many, music and sound clearly tells a story. So what are the stories that are being told? And are there ways in which we could think of music and sound from an ethical perspective as well, in terms of narratives and stories? And seeing again, Nick just flagged this emphasis on using multiple people instead of the full story of a single person. And for me, this really flags a tension that I think many of you, I presume, who work in communications have to grapple with, which is a tension between effective communications and ethical communications. And I'm thinking one of the principles of effective communications, informed by a lot of research in psychology and now neuroscience, is the power of the single story. So the power of what's usually called single identifiable victim effect. So you show an image of a single child, and there's all sorts of research in psychology that shows that the levels of donations on a single child will be greater than when one or more people are presented in an image, that our capacity for sympathy is greatest when the narrative focuses on a single person. Communicators, fundraisers, psychologists know this, and so often use images of one person. And yet somebody here has pointed out that it may be more ethical to show a greater diversity of people in the images. So, many of you, as I suspect, are grappling with some of these tensions. And I think this really brings us to our next question. Beyond the unethical versus ethical communications, what we really want to get into next are where and how you struggle with the ethics of communication. So what kinds of situations or times do you struggle with in your communications work? So again, we'll invite you to respond. Are there times or issues that you struggle with in communications work? So I'll give you a moment to pause, and then while you're responding, Lisa and Marietto will invite you to reflect on perhaps what you think some of the challenges in working through the ethics of communications might be, the less clear-cut cases. Lisa, go ahead.
Do you want me to give a start? Yeah, well, one thing I've been thinking a lot about, and I really appreciate so many of the comments that have come in about the context of the production of the images. And I think that is something which is really being taken so much more seriously, about how to create an ethical context in the production side of the images. And, to really then convey that ethical process in how you communicate about the images themselves. But I think we also need to think a little bit about a situation that we're in right now, really for the first time, frankly, in history, which is where we have social media. And if we ever did imagine that we controlled sort of our own stories and we controlled our own images, we don't now. And so once we get, any kind of an image or even a text out into the public, it really takes on its own traveling life, right? And so I wonder if we would think a little bit about how we can think about ethics and also responsibility in some ways for maintaining dialogue, for trying to keep up with what happens to our images. How is it that our images get picked up and used, by other people or transmitted in different kinds of conversations across, fora like Twitter or Facebook, or photos get posted on Instagram and what they get used for. So, I thought we just sort of think about that side as well. So not just the production side and then the images or the text themselves, but then on the uptake side, right? Maybe the consumption side, if you want to call it. How is it that we, as organizations that are committed to ethical action, can continue to engage and try to understand what's happening to them and try to structure a context, basically, where I know some people talking, like with that very helpful link from Brittany in the chat, that we're basically coming together as a community and saying we don't support unethical communication. People are going to commit to doing things differently, and that's something which has to become a norm. It has to become our own tribal values, how we actually move those forward in the world, but also so that we can educate other people who might just pick up those images and think, oh, here's something funny. And I know this is something that's always a concern for me and my team about what happens to our pictures. We might have something we think is very funny to put up on Twitter, but then is that going to be an image that's going to be received in the tone that we intended it? So maybe I'll just leave it at that and hear what others think of it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Marietu, are there any of these responses that resonate with you, or are there any particular situations that you struggle with in your communications work?
I think that all of them actually kind of, pardon, je pense que la majorité de ces des réponses, si vous voulez, me concernent, mais une des difficultés majeures, moi, en tout cas personnellement, dans mon travail, ça a toujours été les photos des enfants. Ça a toujours été comme une obsession. C'est très, très difficile pour moi. Autrement, je trouve qu'il est très difficile la communication sur les médias sociaux. En fait, je rejoins tout à fait Lisa dans ce qu'elle dit. C'est très, très, très complexe dans la mesure où ce qu'on souhaite faire, c'est vraiment participer à une conversation sur les médias sociaux sans pour autant créer de division. Par contre, je trouve assez difficile de partager un contenu en si peu de caractères ou en si peu de mots. Donc, en fait, il faut toujours un message, si vous voulez, quelque peu tronqué, ou alors il faut aller dans des campagnes de communication pour pouvoir avoir un effet assez important. Donc, je trouve assez difficile la communication sur les médias sociaux. Juste pour vous donner un exemple, il est très difficile d'avoir, si vous voulez, l'attention des médias en tout ce qui a trait à la coopération internationale. Donc ça, on le sait, ce n'est pas évident, à moins qu'il y ait vraiment une crise urgente ou qu'il y ait quelque chose de spécifique pour qu'ils puissent vraiment nous donner toute l'attention dont on a besoin. Alors, des fois, quand on a l'attention des médias, on essaie de sauter vraiment sur l'occasion. Il nous est arrivé de vouloir avoir un entrevue où il se passe quelque chose, puis un journaliste a trouvé notre contact, puis nous appelle sur une situation. On fait un très, très belle entrevue de très, très bonne qualité, puis on est très satisfait. Les journalistes, on fait de nos mieux, par exemple, pour leur expliquer la situation, puis le contexte qu'il y a autour. L'article va paraître, mais le texte va être impeccable, mais la photo qui va accompagner l'article ne sera pas du tout adéquate. Et ça nous est déjà arrivé. La décision qu'on prend dans ce genre de moment-là, c'est que, étant donné que le contenu ne nous appartient pas vraiment parce que ce n'est pas sur une de nos plateformes ou ce n'est pas nous qui avons initié, si vous voulez, le contact, on décide tout simplement de ne pas partager ce contenu parce que même si le texte en tant que tel est correct, l'image qui l'accompagne ou la bande-son qui va l'accompagner ne sera pas adaptée. Puis on ne veut pas, par exemple, que des images misérabilistes soient associées, si vous voulez, à interpares. où ce n'est pas du tout notre philosophie, mais dans ces cas-là, on est obligé de refuser, si vous voulez, l'exposition médiatique. Donc, ce genre de situation-là, on est un petit peu ambigu, on a des regrets, mais on se dit, mais est-ce qu'on saute quand même sur l'occasion, on parle d'interparesse, mais en même temps, on parle d'interparesse, puis l'image qui est associée ne nous correspond pas du tout. Donc, on est obligé de prendre des décisions dans ce genre de cas-là. Puis, je trouve ça un peu difficile. Et c'est dans ce genre de moment qu'on se dit, ben, ce serait quand même bien de parler un petit peu plus de l'importance des photos et de l'impact qu'elles ont, pas seulement dans le milieu de la coopération internationale, mais également autour, qu'on fasse une sensibilisation un peu plus grande. Donc, oui, je pense que des fois, ce genre de situation peut être difficile et puis un petit peu moins clair à trancher.
Thank you. Watching these responses come in, I mean, clearly many of you are deeply grappling with some nuanced tensions I think it comes back to these tensions between ethics and effectiveness. A number of comments about reflecting communities in the ways that they want to be reflected, but that those narratives that people in a community in the Global South may want to share don't necessarily resonate with Canadian or Northern audiences or policymakers, or finding ways to present complexity in ways that are also engaging to Northern audiences. So this balance of engaging Northern audiences on the one hand, while simultaneously representing communities and people and work in the Global South on the other hand. And maybe there's a sweet spot, a magic overlap where it's possible to be effective and ethical at the same time, but clearly many of you are grappling with this. I see, sorry, I'm getting drawn into reading the screen, also concerns about cross-cultural communication, how to convey the narratives from your partners and partner organizations that may not necessarily resonate with the Canadian or other Northern publics. I'm thinking about some of my work in Latin America, where a lot of language is not politically correct. And so if we're using direct quotes, to use a direct quote that doesn't fit the politically correct sensibilities in Canada. So some really awkward challenges here. And a number of reflections on organizations that are struggling with fundraising versus the imagery they use. Lisa, are there any other responses that jump out at you as particularly interesting in terms of ethical complexities or challenges?
Yeah, actually, a lot of them are quite interesting, in fact, and it's so fantastic to have so many people who have so much experience, obviously, from the things that they're writing. One thing I just wanted to call out was this one about, how when what the community needs is really not what people want to donate to. And this is something that I'm very familiar with also in the European aid context, because of course there are always things that people want to donate to, and those tend to always be things that we imagine, have a clear victim story, right? And a salvation possibility, and that there's an obvious reason why we need to step in. And I want to just sort of challenge us and think about, what is our possibility of changing the narrative and changing the narrative back to, frankly, it's not our right to decide what other people should want. I mean, it's our right to decide whether or not we're going to support them. But once we decide to support them, then part of the narrative should be, well, we support them in the kinds of priorities that they set. And I think that that's been something that was tried, with some old school aid back in the day when we used to talk about giving money to basket funds, where, you just give aid to the health sector, for example, in a country like Tanzania, where I've worked for many years, not necessarily to projects only for women and children, right? Or projects only for reproductive health. And that was part of the discussion, was that these people actually have, they have policymakers, they have, a democratically elected government, at that time in this particular context, and that those people should be responsible. So thinking a little bit about, kind of how these really do, even though we're just talking about communications, they really touch on really big issues about who has the right to decide and be responsible for whom. And so I can see that a lot of people seem to be really grappling with that, even as they talk about how to communicate their work.
Mm-hmm. I see another challenge in here that at least one person flagged is the how to respond to unethical communications when we see it from other organizations. There's a comment about calling out versus calling in. What do we do as a sector? And I think this, yeah, that one, thanks, Nick. It speaks to the challenges of oversight capacity, monitoring, what to do, how we should respond. I know this is something that that Cooperation Canada staff have grappled with, and the whole sector grapples with. Is you know, what do we do when we see unethical communications? And clearly, this is something else we need to work on. Is a system for monitoring and responding. Marietu, are there any, before we shift on to the final question, are there any of these responses that that you'd like to speak to briefly before we move on?
Ben, en fait, je voudrais juste être brève. Quand je regarde toutes ces réponses, en fait, ce qui me vient à l'esprit, c'est qu'en fin de compte, le fond du problème, je pense que c'est vraiment que si la communication n'est pas éthique, je pense que pour beaucoup, c'est parce qu'on ne communique pas entre égaux et qu'on pense que c'est le Nord qui va aider le Sud et que c'est vraiment comme une relation on a cette relation d'aide encore, on n'a vraiment pas la relation du travail ensemble. Et je pense que tant qu'on ne travaillera pas sur un même pied d'égalité, on aura encore ces biais dans notre façon de communiquer. Je pense que c'est ça le fond des problèmes. Oui, c'est ce que je voulais partager.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Just before we move on, I see a final button, a final comment down the bottom about who is the hero in our stories, and it's making me think about the course I took in English when I was an undergraduate student many years ago, about the so-called hero's narrative in stories like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. And those are stories. They're powerful. It's a powerful narrative, and it works. It engages us. We love heroes, but I think we need to ask this question: who are the heroes? And far too often, the hero is the northern donor, whether it's an individual donor, you know, my Uncle Bob, who makes a donation to an organization, or it's the NGO or the aid agency that plays the hero role. And clearly, we need to reflect critically on that and try and put actors from the global south in that hero role, rather than the person who is helped by the northern hero. I'm also seeing lots of comments in the chat about the Radiate Awards, the Golden and Rusty Radiator Awards, which I think any of us who know them have really enjoyed those. It also reflects an interesting reflections on the roles of humor and especially satire in communications, and how to engage people, how to use humor and satire to engage people in critical thinking, which I think can be useful. But interestingly, I've shown those videos to a lot of my students in development studies who think they're very funny. They've then taken those videos and showed them to their friends and their roommates who are not students of international development. And very often those other students don't understand them, so they don't get the humor. So within our sector, I think it's also important that we recognize that when we're speaking with each other, we all think those parodies are funny, but they're funny because they're making fun of stereotypes that other people don't recognize as stereotypes in the first place. And that's a sign of how deeply pervasive the stereotypes actually are. I think we've got a little bit less than 20 minutes before we close, so let's move on to our final question, which again takes forward our reflections on how to grapple with ethical choices. So the question: what questions do we need to ask when we're making ethics-based choices about communications? Clearly, we have the Cooperation Canada Code of Ethics as a starting point, and hopefully your responses will reflect the code, but we also hope that you'll share with us other questions based on your experience and practice that we need to ask about ethics-based choices. Nick, please jump in.
Merci. Je vais être très bref. En fait, je veux juste rappeler que notre objectif dans toute cette conversation, c'est d'essayer de bâtir des ressources qui peuvent être disponibles pour nos membres. Et justement, ce genre de questions peut être très utile pour nous. Donc, je vous invite à vraiment y penser. Quelles sont les questions qui peuvent nous aider nos collègues, aider nos pairs à analyser les choix qu'ils ont à faire. Et je voulais aussi rappeler que si vous voulez partager n'importe quelle ressource comme dans la boîte de dialogue, c'est vraiment bienvenu parce qu'on essaie de les collecter justement pour la même fin, de pouvoir avoir du matériel à offrir à nos membres. C'est juste un petit rappel vu qu'on a un peu de temps qui nous reste.
Great, thank you, Nick. Marietu and Lisa, as these images, as the responses are coming up on the screen, please feel free to either comment on them or share with us other questions that you think it is important for us to ask when making decisions about communications.
I just want to call out one thing that just has come up, if that's okay, which is really fantastic, which is asking these big questions, the who questions. And because the who questions are often how we really get to where power is kind of difficult, right? What is it we give and what is it we take? Because someone has written who will our communications affect, right? Are we considering all points of harm and potential violence? Are we consulting with Southern partners and integrating their advice and experiences into our communications practices? And I wonder if it's possible for us to think about, as Mary too also talked about, the different contexts, about every single time. On one hand, we have the code of ethics, which gives us a good overarching foundation, but then every single time you have a new thing to do, you need to have a reference group. You need to have some people that you can show the picture or talk about the message and just be able to understand who is this going to affect. And so how is it that we get our good consultancy group, our good advice givers, our good advisory boards, in an informal or a formal way, that we can actually, engage not just at the overall level, but also in a specific level. And I'll just give the example quickly. In my own project, we have about 16 different collaborators working on everyday humanitarianism in Tanzania, and we take tons of pictures all the time of ourselves, of each other, of our kids, of our pets, of people in the field. And sometimes there's a question about, well, hey, could we use this, for example, on our website? And before anybody puts anything up, we just try to put it up, on a chat group and say, have a look at this. Does everybody think this is okay? And you don't necessarily have to have a long discussion about it, but just to have people who know the context and have a better sense of the who. And so thinking about how we can use that, I think might be helpful. So I appreciate the comment that was put up already.
Great, thank you. Marietu, are there any of these responses that resonate with you? Or any other questions that you think are there any questions missing here that you'd like to add?
Je pense que je me poserai la majorité de ces questions. J'aime beaucoup la première question qui se demande est-ce que cette communication justement va passer le temps correctement. Je pense que c'est la première des questions à se poser. Quand on regarde les communications justement dont on parlait, les photos qu'on veut éviter, celles qui ont été faites il y a 10, 15 ans maintenant, on n'en veut plus. On a même honte de regarder ces photos aujourd'hui. Alors, je pense que c'est très important de se poser la question de qu'est-ce qui va advenir de ces photos ou de cette campagne dans X années. Donc, c'est une des premières questions que je me poserai. Mais les questions tout de suite, dans l'immédiat, je pense que je me pose, c'est vraiment à qui s'adresse cette communication. Donc, l'audience, le public cible est très, très important. Est-ce que c'est le gouvernement? Est-ce que ce sont les donateurs? Est-ce que ce sont juste le public général pour la sensibilisation? Donc, dépendamment de à qui s'adresse notre communication, je pense que ça, c'est important. Mais également, je vois ici « who is studying and who is benefiting ». Donc, ça aussi, c'est important. Donc, à qui cette communication va bénéficier? Est-ce que c'est nous, l'ONG, qui en parlons? Est-ce que c'est nos homologues? Est-ce que c'est les populations qui cherchent à faire parler de leur situation? Donc, ce sont des questions, je pense, qui sont très, très importantes. Puis également, celle de la dignité humaine. En fin de compte, on est tous humains. Puis, ce qu'on cherche à faire, ce n'est pas de se rassurer que oui, nous faisons le bien dans le monde, mais on essaie de faire cause commune. Donc, je pense que ce sont des questions assez importantes à se poser avant de lancer une campagne de communication, quelle qu'elle soit.
Great, thank you. As I'm watching these responses come in, I'm trying to think of ways to group them together, and a fairly straightforward question that I encourage my students to think about when they're analyzing international development and climate change communications is about stereotypes. And the simple question, does an image or a communications product, an image or a story, does it reinforce pre-existing stereotypes or does it challenge those stereotypes? So having the stereotypes in mind and then just asking the question, is this recreating a stereotype or is it helping to challenge and break down stereotypes? We need to have these questions that you're highlighting in our minds as we're doing the work and then as we're going through that critical process to think about the communications before it goes live, goes public. One of the challenges that I see the question, who has the power in the story, and is it our story to tell? Who has the power to tell the story? One of the challenges for all of us doing this work is that almost by definition, it's northern actors, it's the aid agencies, the NGOs, in some cases the academics who have the power to tell the story. And then the challenge is it's on us to figure out how to tell that story as ethically as possible. So it's a power that we can't avoid because our partners often don't have that power to tell the story, and that's our role, but then we have to find ways to work with this. So these are all excellent questions that I think adds a depth and complexity to the code of ethics in terms of interpreting it, putting it into practice, having a longer set of questions that we can apply to thinking about ethical communications. We've got a couple of minutes left, so Lisa and Mariettu, maybe I just invite each of you in 30 seconds or so. Are there any questions that you think are missing or others that you'd like to add? Or if you could pick one question that you think is especially important to ask, what would that question be? Lisa, I'll go back to you first and then you, Mariettu.
Okay, thank you, John. I think that one thing that I really was sort of provoked to think more about from this particular series of questions was about how can we move more from communication to education? And what I mean by that is a little bit more about, the work I've done has shown more and more that NGOs are thought of as content providers, that they're meant to provide the good stories, right, for corporate partners who want to, to make their employees feel good about, partnering, for example, with Save the Children, or, for big philanthropists like the Gates Foundation who want to tell the good story. But how can we move beyond that? How can we basically move beyond content providers of a single story, right? Of an old story, of a typical story that's based in things that we really don't think represent the complexity of the world or the people that we work with or the lives that we ourselves lead. So I'd just like to put it out there. And one thing that I really appreciate so much from this group, which I think is so useful, also from the code of content, is that you're moving beyond, thinking about that as being a job of a few committed individuals or even a couple of good organizations, but being just the whole community, that we actually have to do this, as a community of people who have the same kinds of commitments, even if people are working in their own fields. And I think that that's something that I would really like to see. I'd frankly like to see more of that. I'd like to see it more transnational. I'd like to see these kinds of discussions as being things that take place across different donor partner countries and across, old traditional donors like bilaterals and multilaterals, but let's also bring in the foundations, let's bring in the philanthropists, let's bring in the corporations, and let's make them engage in this kind of discussion where they don't see NGOs as just sort of substandard businesses or as content providers, but actually as people who have long-term respected relationships and have worked much more closely in partnership with communities they claim to serve. So I'm really up for having us try to move from being, communicators to educators, and I'll just stop at that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. As a fellow academic, I appreciate we always want to bring more complexity and tell the full stories and shift to education, and yet the challenges of doing that in a world where 6-second TikTok videos and tweets are the mode of communication. We need to be so concise and simple, but to avoid oversimplification. Marietu, any final words from you? A particular question that you think is especially important, or a question that may be missing here?
Je ne pense pas qu'il y ait une question qui manque vraiment. Je pense que la question que j'aime vraiment beaucoup, c'est celle de savoir comment est-ce que la campagne que j'ai faite il y a 10 ans, ou que j'ai faite il y a 5 ans, comment est-ce qu'elle va vieillir et comment est-ce qu'on va l'apercevoir. Je pense qu'on en apprend beaucoup sur les actes qu'on a fait avant. Donc ça, c'est une question que je pense que j'appellerai les communicants à se poser toujours avant de faire certaines campagnes. Autrement, je pense qu'il est vraiment très important pour les communicateurs de ne pas nourrir certains biais. Donc les biais notamment du nord encore et dans le sud, et de ne pas continuer, de ne pas perpétuer une imagerie qui est dégradante ou qui ne respecte pas la dignité humaine. Je pense qu'il est très important de ne pas toujours céder à l'émotion par rapport à l'information justement et par rapport à l'éducation. Donc j'inviterai les communicants à discuter de ce genre de questionnement. Je suis contente qu'on ait le code d'éthique justement de Coopération Canada qui déjà nous aide à nous orienter. Puis je suis contente également d'avoir cette discussion avec tout le monde. Je pense que c'est très riche. J'ai hâte de lire le livre de Lisanne, puis d'en apprendre un petit peu plus. Mais je pense que voilà.
Thank you very much, Marietu and Lisa. I'd like to thank both of you very much for your interventions, and then pass the microphone over to Nick to explain the next steps in this process with the Code of Ethics, and I think also to invite you to share your feedback on this session. There should be a link appearing in the chat soon. Nick, over to you.
Well, actually, I think I'll ask MP Boisvert on our team to sort of wrap things up, because the Code of Ethics is really going to fall in her area of work and engagement with members. I'll just, I should apparently share my screen again, so I will do that. And MP, over to you.
Hi, yes, thank you, Nick. So I just, if you could put back the Menti real quick. Yes, thank you. So we have a question or two after this slide. I would love to hear from you if you think of any next steps that we could go forward with as an organization, because I know that Coopération Canada has a role to play in informing members of, how could I say this? Making the Code of Ethics something that's alive. And so we will be constantly thinking about how to make it better and how to better communicate, certainly, but also do more in the other sections of the Code of Ethics. This section actually relates to fundraising as well, but we thought that that would be a whole other session that we needed to do. So really, this was only the first step. We wanted to know a little bit about what members thought about ethical communications and dive deeper into this subject. But I think that it has been quite a success, this session, and that if we do the same kind of format for the other sections of the Code of Ethics, I'm hoping that we will have the same kind of amazing engagement, because I think that all the questions and comments that we received and the amazing participation of our three panelists definitely was very insightful and helpful. So I'm seeing some ideas and suggestions coming up. So yes, hands-on workshops for commissions is a very good idea, definitely. Discussing how it could be improved. Maybe better explaining why it's problematic. And yes, it could be a topic with the ED group to discuss, because certainly some of the participants in this call are already doing this work, and like we saw in the poll at the beginning, lots of them are already doing this kind of process to see if their communications are ethical in an informal way, and maybe want to make it more formal. But some of the people who should be hearing this are not here. So definitely we can make this a broader discussion at some point, and that I think that would be definitely helpful to disseminate this topic across the board in other groups and working groups. So we will definitely keep these ideas and suggestions in our toolbox and consider these for later sessions. Engaging younger people and consider how communications might be different. I see a question in the chat about whether the Menti comments will be made available. This is definitely possible. We're definitely going to do an internal report, so maybe we can give this report or part of the report to our members, and that makes a lot of sense, because maybe you didn't want to take the time to just jot these all down because there were so many going on at the same time. So now you have you will have this pre-formatted for you. So we'll try and do that definitely.
If I could
yes.
add, actually, MP, I think, just saying this for us was a first important workshop to hear from you. We're going to be looking at what we heard and packaging that and sending it back to members. We really want to get to a place where we can start to sort of collect resources. It's not a great comparison, but the Canada Revenue Agency has guidance when you're filling out your taxes, right? And so that's not part of the regulations, but it's to help you understand the regulations. And that's sort of, although the Code of Ethics isn't regulations, that's sort of what we'd like to get at, is to providing living resources and support around the Code of Ethics for our members. And so this is a first foray into that. We'll look at what we heard, packaging what resources we can, validate with members again before we then sort of publish it. So just wanted to sort of give a line of sight on that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And I think that the whole subject of the Code of Ethics is definitely very complex and needs to be dived into in a variety of different ways. And so this is really a test for us. So we'll see for the other sections if this method applies or not. But it's good to see this amazing engagement, because it sounds kind of boring when you hear about it. You're just like, oh, it's going to be a session on the Code of Ethics, but it was actually really interesting and very useful, I think, for everyone who was on the call. So I have one last question, I think, if we go to the next slide. So about links and resources, I see that people shared some. Maybe you could share them directly in the Menti. That would be great. So we'll have everything in the same place. But we will definitely remember the resources that were shared in the chat. And if you also think that there could be other steps related to communications that we should do in near future, we can definitely talk about that. Maybe have a micro working group or maybe a temporary working group. That's what I should call it, instead of something that goes on for years and years. Maybe it should, I don't know, but that's also something that we could consider. So it's 4 o'clock. I just want to say before we log off, everyone, that this was the last session of the forum. And I know, Nick, you'll probably have a moment to say goodbye to everyone, but this was my first forum with Coopération Canada, and it was really nice. I wish that the next one will be at least partly in person, because I'm really a people person, and Zoom is just not the same. And so I just want to say thank you to all of our participants and all of our panelists and speakers, and also, of course, to our magnificent staff. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, MP. And we have really reached the hour. And, you know, were this a conference in person, we'd still have everyone there. And we have had over 400 participants this week in different sessions. They've picked and chosen the ones that they wanted to participate in. Really grateful that you stuck around with us for this. Incredibly helpful to influence our work going forward and engaging with you. The fact is that we're not all in one place. So this does feel a little bit like it ends with a fizzle in a sense as the forum, but really a valuable panel that we have had here. I really want to express my thanks to you, John, to Marietou, and to Lisa Ann. Your work is incredibly useful to us, very informative. I'm sure that we'll have follow-up questions for you. I have no doubt. And so I just want to maybe, John, I don't know if you wanted to close up, and then we'll thank everyone.
Just very quickly, thank you everyone for sharing your insights, and especially thank you Lisa Ann and Marietou for being spontaneous and responding spontaneously as we watch the responses come in. Again, like Nick, I would love to be able to spill out of this formal session into more discussion with all of you. Hopefully we can do that again soon. So thank you everyone. This has been a great opportunity for me to learn from you.
Thank you all. Bye now.